The cameras were rolling on what seemed like a typical Family Feud episode, when 69-year-old Joe Martinez shuffled onto the stage wearing worn overalls and a faded flannel shirt that had seen better days. But what this humble farmer was about to reveal would leave Steve Harvey speechless and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary wealth hides behind the most ordinary appearance. It was a Wednesday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta, and Steve Harvey was in his element, that perfectly tailored navy suit, contrasting sharply with the Martinez family's simple farm clothes. The Martinez clan from rural Nebraska was facing off against the Williams family from Chicago, and everything seemed set for another heartwarming episode about hard-working American families. But Joe Martinez wasn't just any farmer. He stood at the family podium, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked the soil for decades, his face lined with years of sun exposure, and his humble demeanor suggesting a man who had never known luxury. When Steve introduced the family during the opening segment, Joe's responses painted a picture of financial struggle. "So Joe," Steve had said during introductions, "tell us about your farm in Nebraska." "Well, Mr. Steve," Joe had replied in his soft, measured voice, "I got a little place where I grow potatoes and corn. Been farming the same land for 40 years now." 40 years? That's dedication, man. How many acres you working? Joe had paused, looking down modestly. "Oh, just a small operation. Nothing fancy. We get by." Steve noticed something in Joe's answer. It was vague, in a way that suggested either humility or something else entirely. But he moved on, not suspecting that he was talking to one of the wealthiest men to ever appear on his show. The game progressed normally for the first 2 rounds. The Martinez family was doing well, with Joe surprising everyone by showing an unexpected knowledge of business and investment terms. But it was during the 3rd round, when the category was things rich people own, that Joe's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Steve asked the question, "Name something a wealthy person might own a lot of." It was Joe's turn at the podium. He stepped forward slowly, his worn boots making soft sounds on the studio floor. For a moment he seemed to wrestle with something internally. "Land," Joe said quietly. "Land," Steve announced enthusiastically. "Good answer, Joe. Let's see how many people said land." The board revealed it was the number 1 answer. The Martinez family celebrated, but Steve noticed Joe wasn't sharing in their excitement. Instead, the old farmer was staring at his feet with an expression that seemed almost guilty. "Joe, you okay there, buddy?" Steve asked, approaching the podium. That's when Joe looked up, and Steve saw something in his eyes that changed everything. Not the simple contentment of a hard-working farmer, but the complex weight of someone carrying a massive secret. "Mr. Steve," Joe said, his voice barely audible, "can I tell you something?" The studio fell quiet. There was something in Joe's tone that commanded attention, something that suggested they were about to venture into uncharted territory. "Of course, Joe. What's on your mind?" Joe took a deep breath, looking out at his family, then back at Steve. "I think I might have lied to you about my farm." Steve's eyebrows raised. "How so?" "When I said it was small," Joe paused, his weathered hands gripping the podium. "It's not exactly small." The audience leaned forward. Steve sensed they were approaching something significant. "How not small are we talking, Joe?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a secret he'd been keeping for decades. 12,000 acres. The studio erupted. Steve's mouth fell open. The Martinez family turned to stare at Joe in shock. 12,000 acres? Steve repeated, walking closer to Joe. "Joe, that's not a small farm. That's an empire." But Joe wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and 40 years of carefully guarded secrets began pouring out. "And it's not just one farm," Joe continued, his voice growing stronger. "I own farmland in 7 states: Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, Missouri, Minnesota, and North Dakota." Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of contestants, heard thousands of stories, but this was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. A man dressed like he couldn't afford new clothes, talking about owning farmland across half the American Midwest. "Joe," Steve said gently, "help me understand. Why are you dressed like you're struggling financially?" Joe looked down at his worn overalls and faded shirt. Because this is who I am, Mr. Steve. I'm a farmer. I work the land. The fact that I own more of it than most people doesn't change what I do every day. But Steve was just getting started in understanding the magnitude of Joe's hidden empire. Joe, can you help me with the math here? 12,000 acres across 7 states. What are we talking about in terms of value? Joe shifted uncomfortably. Well, farmland prices vary by region and quality. Joe, Steve said more firmly, what's your farm worth? The old farmer looked at Steve with eyes that held decades of secrets. About $47 million. The studio exploded. The audience gasped, audibly. Steve's signature stop gesture went up as he processed what he'd just heard. The Martinez family was staring at Joe as if seeing him for the first $47 million? Steve repeated. Joe, you're a multi-millionaire? I suppose I am, Joe said quietly. Steve began pacing, his mind racing. Joe, your family, do they know? Joe shook his head. They know I farm, but they don't know how much land I own. They've been trying to help me financially for years. My grandson started a GoFundMe last month because he thought I couldn't afford my medication. The cameras caught Steve's expression changing from amazement to something deeper, a recognition that he was witnessing something profound about family, humility, and the complex relationship between wealth and identity. But what Joe revealed next would prove that his financial empire was just the beginning of his extraordinary story. Mr. Steve, Joe continued, there's something else, something more important than the money. Steve stopped pacing. What's that, Joe? For the past 20 years, I've been buying up small farms when families can't afford to keep them anymore. Not to add to my holdings, but to help farming families stay on their land. Steve's expression shifted again. What do you mean? When a farming family is about to lose their farm to the bank, I buy it at market value, then lease it back to them for what they can afford. Sometimes that's $100 a month, since it's just the cost of the property taxes. The studio was completely silent. Steve Harvey, who had made a career of quick wit and perfect timing, was speechless. Joe, Steve finally managed. How many families? 437 families across 7 states. About 8,000 people total who get to stay on their land because I can afford to help. Steve removed his navy suit jacket and walked to Joe. Without a word, he draped it around the old farmer's shoulders. Joe, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. You're not just a farmer. You're not even just a millionaire. You're a guardian angel for American agriculture. But Joe wasn't finished. The decades of secrecy were crumbling, and more secrets emerged. There's one more thing, Mr. Steve. The reason I came on this show. Steve, still processing everything he'd learned, looked at Joe expectantly. My grandson's GoFundMe page? The one to help with my medication? It raised $14,000 from people who don't have much money themselves. Good people trying to help what they thought was a struggling egger. Joe's voice broke slightly. I can't keep that money. But I also can't tell my family the truth without embarrassing them. So I thought, if I won some money on your show, could give the GoFundMe money to other farming families who really need it. Steve Harvey knelt down in front of Joe Martinez, right there on the Family Feud stage, in front of millions of viewers. Joe, Steve said, in 40 years of television, I have never met anyone like you. You own $47 million worth of farmland. You've kept 437 families on their farms, and you came on this show to figure out how to give away $14,000 in charity without hurting your family's feelings. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. But Steve had one more surprise for Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve announced to the studio and television audience, I'm going to do something I've never done before. Joe Martinez, you don't need to play this game to win money. You've already won something bigger than money. You've won the respect of everyone who meets you. Steve pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. Nebraska Agricultural Foundation, this is Steve Harvey from Family Feud. I need to talk to someone about honoring a very special farmer. Within minutes, the president of the Nebraska Agricultural Foundation was on speakerphone, confirming what Joe had been too modest to mention. He was legendary in agricultural circles as the anonymous benefactor who had saved hundreds of family farms. Joe Martinez, came the voice through the speakers, is known throughout the Midwest as the Ghost Farmer. For 20 years, farming families have been saved by an anonymous buyer who helps them keep their land. We never knew his identity until today. The episode that aired became one of the most watched in Family Feud history. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about the quiet heroes who use their wealth not for luxury but for lifting up others. Joe's story inspired the creation of the Martinez Family Farm Preservation Fund, which has since helped over 1,000 additional farming families stay on their land. The GoFundMe money was donated as Joe intended, but it was joined by millions more from viewers inspired by his story. Today, Joe Martinez still lives in the same modest farmhouse he's called home for 40 years, still wears the same simple clothes, and still works his land every day. But now he does it without the burden of secrecy, supported by a family who understands that true wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you give. Steve Harvey often tells the story of Joe Martinez when he speaks about unexpected heroes. "I thought I was meeting a poor farmer," Steve says. "Instead, I met one of the richest men in America, not because of his bank account, but because of his heart." The jacket Steve gave Joe that day hangs in Joe's modest farmhouse. But more importantly, it represents something profound. The idea that greatness often comes disguised as ordinary, that wealth's true purpose is service, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who chooses to appear powerless. Joe Martinez proved that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a farmer in worn overalls working the land, helping his neighbors and keeping the secret that he could change their lives, one family farm at a time.